Ready? Committee will come to order. We are meeting this morning to consider the committee's views and estimates of the federal budget for fiscal year 2017, as well as H.R. 4294, the SAVERS Act of 2015. We'll have separate opening statements for each. Our first order of business is the committee's views and estimates of the federal budget for FY 2017. We are operating on an accelerated timeline for considering this letter this year, as the Budget Committee has requested our thoughts by the end of this week. Our views and estimates letters is an excellent reminder that the work of our committee, it directly impacts the economy and the life of every single American. As we discussed yesterday, we've just got to get this economy moving. Today, our letter provides more detail on how we are moving forward with the pro-growth agenda that will help our country achieve its potential. We're working to reform our welfare programs, improve our health care system, and strengthen Social Security. We're also providing more information on our efforts to reduce the debt, fix our broken tax code, and make it easier for American companies to sell our products overseas. The letter we're sending today clearly communicates how we're taking action on all policy fronts to grow our economy and help the American people. This time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Levin or his designee for a statement on the views and estimates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In recent years, Republican budgets in the House have included blindly ideological priorities, leading to harmful fiscal consequences. They have focused on slashing effective anti-poverty programs, ending Medicare, and starving other necessary programs. This approach has undermined our committee's efforts to find and act on common ground within our jurisdiction. So Democrats will send our own letter today to the Budget Committee, asking them to take a different approach and craft a budget that builds on recent economic growth and makes room for bipartisan cooperation on some important problems facing our nations, problems we need to address like tax reform and closing unfair loopholes and growing inequality. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of the views and estimates, which was shared in advance with the minority without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. My understanding is that we will have no amendments to the committee's view and estimates federal budget for fiscal year 2017. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? I do. Mr. Engel is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to cause a problem. I just want to see how I can explain that the President of the United States, he says he wants to, what are we on then? Yes, sir. I withdraw my request.
Thank you. Does any other member wish to strike the last word? I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee approve the committee's views and estimates of the federal budget for the fiscal year 2017 for purposes of submission to the Committee on the Budget.
Questions on the motion to approve the views and estimates? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. No. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The committee's views and estimates of the federal budget for fiscal year 2017 are approved for submission to the Committee on the Budget. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the views and estimates. The next order of business is H.R. 4294, a bill introduced by Mr. Roscom and Mr. Neal to amend the Internal Revenue Code to ensure that retirement investors receive advice in their best interest. I'll begin with a brief opening statement and yield the remainder of my time to the author, Mr. Roscom. I'd like to begin today by thanking Subcommittee Chairman Roscom and Ranking Member Neal for taking the lead on this important legislation. I'm also grateful for Education and Workforce Committee Chairman Klein and Subcommittee Chairman Rowe's work on a companion bill, H.R. 4293, which would make parallel changes to ERISA. This bipartisan bill will enhance protections for retirement plans and individuals saving for retirement. At the same time, the bill will allow Americans to continue obtaining investment advice and other retirement products and services using whatever model they think works best for them. Last April, the administration proposed a counterproductive fiduciary rule governing retirement advice. We believe that rule would significantly harm millions of small businesses and ordinary Americans saving for retirement. The proposal would effectively eliminate the most popular marketplace arrangements used by low and middle income Americans to obtain retirement advice and services. At least this time, the administration isn't advertising that if you like your investment advisor, you can keep your investment advisor. This rule is even more catastrophic when considered together with other initiatives that undermine our retirement system, including its fiduciary protections. As if the administration intends for the rule to force Americans out of 401ks and IRAs and into the government plans for private sector workers, promoted by other administrative initiatives. I'd like to thank Mr. Roskin and Mr. Neal for doing everything possible to stop this from happening and for having Congress set the high standards for our savers in America. And I'll yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Roskin, the sponsor of the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work on the fiduciary rule and for scheduling this timely markup of H.R. 4294, the SAVERS Act. And I'm grateful to Congressman Neal and Congressman Larson for their leadership on this issue and their willingness to personally spend tremendous time and energy advancing a goal that we all support, that is, encouraging Americans to plan and save for a financially secure retirement. I'd also like to recognize Chairman Phil Rowe, who introduced H.R. 4293, the Affordable Retirement Advice Protection Act, which changes ERISA, the federal retirement statute, to mirror the legislation that we're considering today. And it's my hope that these bills will move together as a unified package as they advance to the House floor. So here's the backstory. Last April, the Department of Labor issued a proposed rule that would dramatically alter the definition of a fiduciary. The administration argues that this rule is necessary to protect individuals from saving for retirement from bad investment advice. It's a laudable goal, but the proposal was deeply flawed. And you don't have to take my word for it. There were 386,000 individual comments that the Department of Labor received on the proposal, many from ordinary Americans saving for retirement or small businesses that were trying to do the right thing and offer a retirement savings plan to their employees. Some of them we heard in the Oversight Subcommittee when we had a hearing on this. The concerns were broad and they were deep. Now, we can stipulate that we need policies to root out bad actors in the retirement savings industry who are taking advantage of consumers to benefit their own financial interests. This bill does that. By expanding and strengthening the definition of a fiduciary and requiring investment advisors to always act in the best interests of their clients when providing investment advice. The legislation creates a new, enforceable best interest requirement, significantly strengthening current legal protections for retirement savers. The bill also ensures individuals saving for retirement can continue to access a wide variety of investment products and services, including annuities. Unlike the Department of Labor proposal, this bill would not force savers into fixed fee arrangements, which can raise the cost of investing and investment advice, an approach that hurts those with moderate savings and lower incomes the most. The bill also requires smarter, not just more, disclosure. Rather than flooding consumers with a mountain of fine print and data they're bound to ignore, we require clearly communicated disclosure of key information about the compensation an advisor stands to earn and whether the advice they're providing is generic or individually tailored to meet specific retirement savings goals. This ensures consumers have the information they need to make well-informed decisions. By contrast, the Department of Labor proposal requires endless disclosures that won't accomplish anything and treats savers as if they're fools to comparison shop for a quality investment advisor and the investment products and services that best suit their own retirement planning needs. I don't know about you, but when I hear about working families and individuals in my district, they tell me they don't need more government making choices for them and how they plan for their futures. And finally, our bill has strong protections against bad actors in the retirement industry. If an advisor gives bad advice for their own financial benefit instead of their clients, they have to make the client whole for all the damages. This is a strong, new, enforceable standard that will better protect every American saving for retirement. And in closing, the SAVERS Act represents a sensible, bipartisan solution to strengthen retirement savings and help American workers have the tools they need to plan for a secure future. I look forward to working with every member of the committee to advance this important legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you are designee are now recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We should not be holding this markup today It is essentially an attempted end run around the rulemaking process. What this bill would do is amend the rules that determine when investment advice given by an advisor to an employee benefit plan investor gives rise to fiduciary status. This issue is indeed an important one. Plan participants and IRA owners are often not experienced investors. They rely on advice that is given to them by investment professionals. Ensuring that this advice is impartial and free from conflicts of interest is critical. The administration first issued proposed regulations on this issue 6 years ago in 2010. They received many comments from consumer and industry groups and decided to redraft the proposal. That proposal, issued last year, prompted more than 3,000 comment letters. The administration has stated, and I emphasize this, that it has taken these comments and the numerous consultations on all sides of this issue into account when they prepared a final draft of the rule. That draft is now being considered by OMB. Nobody on this committee has seen that final draft. We should wait until the final rule is issued, and Congress and consumers and industry groups have had adequate time to review it before considering any legislation in this area. This bill sets a harmful precedent, and I emphasize that. It is one that Republicans want as part of their effort to pass the REINS Act, a bill they pushed last summer that would effectively bring agency rulemaking to a standstill by requiring an affirmative yes vote from both chambers of Congress before a final rule may become effective. This bill includes a similar requirement for the upcoming rule. We should not be a party to this very dangerous effort. I yield the balance of my time to a sponsor of the bill, Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. It's important for us to remember this morning that half the people that get up and go to work every single day in America are not in a qualified retirement plan. I have spent a career on this committee working on retirement issues. I have defended Social Security as vigorously as any member of our caucus. I have proposed the auto IRA bill, and I would hope the opening is here today for some Republicans to sign on to this bill. In addition, I have worked on opt-out. The American people are now more than ever in charge of their retirement plans. The whole notion of the defined benefit has been replaced by the defined contribution. People simply need more advice, not less. This legislation is clearly motivated by the notion of client first. Best practices, full transparency, and get rid of the bad actors. There is no nefarious motive attached to the endeavor that we undertake today. In addition, 96 Democrats, including the author and the individual who inspired the effort, Congressman Gwendolyn Moore of Milwaukee, who has led the effort, as well as Jared Polis, who as recently as yesterday authored a new letter to the Labor Department. We are entirely hopeful that we can still reconcile the differences that exist in terms of legitimate purpose. The interest here is the client, and to make sure that they get satisfactory professional advice. And last point of emphasis here. The issue in retirement savings, where I have chided industry groups time and again, is over the process of annuitization. Getting rid of the bad actors in annuitization by higher professional standards ought to also be part of our obligation this morning. I would just urge our friends on the other side of the aisle as an act now of goodwill to at least one to sign on to my auto IRA bill.
Committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4294. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read. Open for amendment at any point. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance, along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Thomas Barthold of the Joint Committee on Taxation to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Levin, and members of the committee. You have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 5 and JCX 6, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In short, the code prohibits self-dealing transactions. These are called prohibited transactions under the code. Self-dealing transactions between qualified retirement plan or an IRA or other tax-favored account and a person who is a fiduciary with respect to that plan or that IRA. Now, for this purpose, a fiduciary includes a person who, for a fee, provides advice with respect to investment of the assets of the qualified plan or the IRA. The bill, as amended, defines circumstances in which a recommendation with respect to investment of the assets of the plan or the IRA constitute or does not constitute investment advice that results in fiduciary status. Now, in addition, the prohibited transaction rules also contain various exemptions under which a transaction that would otherwise be prohibited is permitted, subject to conditions. The chairman's amendment, in the nature of a substitute, also provides an exemption under which a fiduciary can provide investment advice and receive fees that vary depending upon whether a recommended investment is actually made. Now, in recognition that the Department of Labor has proposed regulations that would also revise the application of fiduciary standards, the effective date of this legislation is 61 days after the date of enactment and would apply with respect to information provided or recommendations made on or after 2 years after the date of enactment. This 61-day effective date rule allows that the Congress can approve prior to the 61st day new rules that may be promulgated by the administration subsequent to January 1st of 2015 by passing a bill or joint resolution in which event the amendments made by H.R. 4294 as amended will not take effect. That concludes my brief description. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold?
Yes.
Mr. Rangel is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Balco, what impact would the passage of, good morning, what impact would the passing of this legislation have on the proposed Department of Labor regulation covering the question of self-dealing?
The legislation would not allow any regulation that would make changes subsequent to regulations in effect on January 1st of 2015. So in other words, any new regulation would not allow that regulation to take effect unless, as I just noted in explaining how the effective date worked, the Congress were to pass a bill or joint resolution that said these regulations can take effect, in which case the changes as outlined in 4294 would not take effect.
But 4294 is not changing existing regulation because we are expecting the DOL to give us what that regulation would be. So in fact, what is 4294 changing if we don't have the regulation before us now?
Well, 4294 does make changes with respect to fiduciary status under present law. That would necessitate at some point that the Department of Labor, Department of Treasury would promulgate regulations consistent with the change in law if 4294 were enacted.
So as it relates to parliamentary procedure, what we are considering is enacting law that would prevent us from reviewing what the administration would be suggesting would be guidelines to protect clients. Is that correct?
I think the effective date, the effective date, as I was trying to explain, allows for the Congress to consider regulations that the administration might advance.
Well, that's the part I don't understand. Why are we enacting? If we're going to consider the regulation that the administration may advance, that's the status we're in now without this legislation, right? Waiting for the proposal.
Your regulations were proposed, they've not been
Now,
finalized.
the language that you use, and you always use very careful selection of words, so what we are doing is enacting law, but at the same time, we can still consider the proposal after this becomes law?
I've found before the committee that the committee often considers changes that have been made in the past by either law or in the prior Congress or regulation.
I just want to know what we are supposed to be doing. If I understood what the committee was doing, I wouldn't be asking you these questions.
Okay.
You are basically saying that we are enacting law that is supposedly protecting clients against wrongdoers. We're doing this knowing that the administration is about to give us a regulation to do just that. So we're going to establish what the relationship is going to be, notwithstanding that most every consumer protection group opposes it. But at the same time, we're saying that when the administration finally gives us their proposal from a legal legislative point of view, the legislation allows us to do what?
This legislation would make certain changes in fiduciary status. It also allows, it also says that absent other congressional action, any regulations that the Department of Labor may be proposing that would affect, that would take effect after a year ago, basically any new regulations.
So this strikes out any ideas the administration may have.
Do not take effect.
We're saying whatever you intend to do, we appreciate it, but this is what we're going to do ahead of time.
It says change the underlying statute, and then
a
change in the underlying statute,
so we're
of course,
ignoring
gives rise to new
the DOL
regulations.
proposal is not and has never been considered by this committee that you know of.
Right.
Okay, good. I yield back balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Barthold, to be clear, does Congress, specifically this committee, have jurisdiction over this area of the law? And are we permitted to, at any time, promulgate changes, propose changes in that law that would protect our investors, chase bad actors out, and as Mr. Neal said, put our clients first, and customers first? Under the law, that is our jurisdiction, correct?
As I noted in the description, Mr. Chairman, there's the code prohibits self-dealing, and that's the basis of the changes that are proposed in H.R. 4294, is to change what are defined as prohibited transactions under the code.
So this is,
it's the committee's jurisdiction.
I'd be glad to yield. Yes, sir.
This does not take away the president's right to veto, does it?
To my knowledge, no.
Oh, good.
I think most of us know that, but thankfully, we're not either abdicating our authority and jurisdiction on behalf of our constituents to make changes to the law that can protect them. And that's what I see us doing here today,
Good,
in a very thoughtful, very constructive, very bipartisan manner. Mr. McDermott, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, the Council of Economic Advisors has determined that the conflicts of interest in investment advice costs consumers $17 billion annually in retirement savings. How much will this the change in the standard, save for consumers?
We have not made an estimate of of that sort, Mr. McDermott. And I don't know if anyone has done a comparable analysis as to what the changes that would be wrought by 4294 would mean in terms of the type of analysis that the Council of Economic Advisors previously provided.
Would it be fair then to say you don't have any idea what the effect of this bill would be?
I don't have a quantitative idea of what the effect would be. I've tried to describe a little bit what the effect would be. It makes, for example, current guidelines generally don't treat recommendations on rollovers as investment advice that could become subject to the fiduciary standard rule. This bill would. So in that sense, that's an example of that I would think you would consider tightening present law rules.
Can I stop you? You're running my time here. You're a great filibuster. I loved you. When we had the hearing on this bill and we had the people come in and testify as to the effect of it, do you remember them telling us how much it would save or if it would be effective or anything or make any kind of estimate?
I think it was only in a very qualitative sense, Mr. McDermott. I don't think anyone gave a quantitative estimate. Again, I don't think anyone has made a quantitative estimate.
Are you aware of any hearing that we've had where this bill has been out in the public and people could come and testify both for and against the positive values or the negative values of it?
No, since we're early in the Congress, of course, no hearing in this Congress, sir.
So this bill was dropped in December, and suddenly we're hearing it, we're passing it out of here without ever having a hearing is really basically what you're saying, I think. Is that correct?
There has not been a hearing on this particular legislation.
There are two main issues that you're supposed to deal with. One is who's the bill's standard would apply to, and how it would impact the existing consumer protections. Do you know how many more investment advisors it would be applied to because of the changes in the law that we are considering passing here?
Again, sir, I do not have a quantitative estimate of the number of people who might newly be deemed a fiduciary under the change in standards.
So we don't know whether we're throwing a net out there, but we're not sure we're catching the bad actors, is basically what you're saying. You have no idea who might also be included in this. Is that correct?
I'd like not to claim that I have no idea. Again, qualitatively, Mr. McDermott, as I gave the example in the case of a rollover, I think it's quite clear that you've expanded the potential for whom might fall under the fiduciary standards, and that would be extending the consumer protections that you see in those.
In looking at the bill, and you've looked at the language, and you're describing it here for us today, do you think the language tightens or loosens the standard that currently applies to fiduciaries?
Yeah, I think on net we're making it tighter.
In what sense? Give me the specific.
Well, I gave you the one specific example. We also used to be a requirement it is a requirement under present law that a person who renders advice has to render advice on a regular basis to be a fiduciary. There's no longer the regular basis requirement.
So a guy can do it once every 6 months.
Well, regular would depend just on how people see it, how it would be enforced by the Department of Labor. I can't give you if the standard was based on once a week, twice a week.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else wish to ask a question? Mr. Roskins recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just try and address some of these issues that have been raised and put this into a context. So the backstory is in an attempt to get bad actors out of the investment space, the Department of Labor promulgated a rule that took the breath away of 96 Democrats. I mean, think about it. 96 Democrats wrote a letter to the White House, to their own party, that said, this is trouble. This is a problem. 300,000+ comments have come in. The Department of Labor has basically sort of stiff-armed everybody in the process and said, thank you very much, we're taking all this under the consideration, but there's been no disclosure of what they're trying to do. So this is not an end run around the rulemaking process. The Congress creates the rulemaking process. The Congress is accountable for the rulemaking progress. Now the Congress is asserting itself in the rulemaking process. And what it's doing is it's setting a standard that doesn't exist today. So in other words, industry didn't come and say, you know what, give us a new higher standard. This bill creates a best interest standard. That raises a new standard that doesn't exist in current law. Now what's interesting is if the Department of Labor has taken all these things into consideration, and they've come up and they've listened to the 96 Democrats in the House. They've listened to the 300,000+ concerns that have been articulated or comments that have been articulated around the country. And they come up with a rule that we all think is a good rule. Then we say, hey, it's a good rule. Great. We'll adopt it. Fine. No harm, no foul. If, however, Democrats' breath is still taken away, and they're not coming up with a rule, and they're basically patting people on the head and saying, oh, you're going to love it, just wait, it's going to be great, and it's not great, then we have something in place that actually gets us to where we need to be. So there's been this notion that somehow we should recede and not play a role in the rulemaking process. I reject that. We're the Ways and Means Committee. This is our responsibility. So we're raising a standard, and here's the problem. The problem is that the current Department of Labor rule as promulgated, and there's no substantive indication to believe that this has changed fundamentally, says that now in order to give investment advice, you have to be a fiduciary. Think about the standard that is. That would be as if Congressman Larson comes to me and says, Peter, how do you get downtown to, how do you get down to the Washington Monument? And as a fiduciary, in this example, I would have to safely carry him down to the Washington Monument. And if I were, that's a load, I would have to safely carry him down to the Washington Monument and make sure he got there safely. I couldn't say, hey, here's what you do. You go down to the mall, you look for the big thing, and that's the Washington Monument. If I did that and he were hurt along the way or something happened along the way, under the DOL proposal, I would be responsible. That's ridiculous. And so what ends up happening under the proposed rule, and this is why 96 Democrats said basically to their own Department of Labor, you got to be kidding me. This creates a wedge between the Main Street investment advisor and somebody with a modest 401k that calls up and says, hey, what do? I need to roll this 401k over. And under the proposed rule, you would break that relationship. They wouldn't be able to have that advice. And what does the DOL say? Go to a website. Go to a website and get your advice. None of us is in favor of that. So what we're trying to do is come up with something that's thoughtful, that's bipartisan, that's measured, that gives the administration the opportunity, if the rule is as it purports to be, and it is sunshine and roses, and they say you're going to love this, then great, there's a mechanism for it to be put in place. If, however, it's not, then we're able to reflect the concern of 96 Democrats and a lot of Republicans and thousands of people out there who've taken the time to comment on a Department of Labor regulation. Can you imagine that? People going online and typing in and making comments. We've got the opportunity to absorb those questions, create a better product, raise a standard that doesn't exist, and move forward and get the bad actors out of this space. This is reasonable, this is measured, this is thoughtful, this is timely, this deserves our support. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartow, let me make sure I understand. So when did you first start to review this legislation?
Well, Mr. Becerra, you know that we often work with member offices as they develop legislation, but I think the appropriate answer is it was introduced in December, and that's when we began kind of more formal review. But we have worked with a number of different members on issues such as these that would go in multiple different directions, as we always do.
So when did it was introduced December 18th, when did you actually your staff begin to do the analysis of this legislation so you'd be prepared for a hearing like this, markup?
Basically after the first of the year, since we did take some
so
time.
within the last month?
Yes.
Okay. And I only ask because I know that the Department of Labor has been working with many of us and the stakeholders, both within the industry and, of course, with groups that represent consumers and workers and folks who do these investments for over 6 years. And so for many of us, it's an open question why we would move so quickly on a bill that's only been before us for about a month that would dramatically change the standards that we have and would impose restrictions on the ability of our government to move forward with its regulatory power to provide protections for consumers. And so it's distressing to hear that only within the last month were you examining this bill and we're already being asked to mark it up without ever having had a hearing to discuss the merits or demerits of the bill. Let me ask this. Mr. Roscom gave an example. I agree, I would hate to have to carry John Larson myself, but it's not so much an issue of having to, I know, John. Good. He ain't heavy, he's my brother. You're my brother, but carrying is another thing. I think that's not the apt example to give. Let's give something that's more directly related to what we're talking about. It's not about carrying somebody a mile or two. It's about whether someone's going to give you the best advice so that when you invest your precious money, and I think for the most part we're talking about folks who aren't the most sophisticated investors, certainly the folks in my congressional district where the average income is about $35,000 in Los Angeles, you don't have a whole lot of money to invest. And so it's a matter of making sure that you're getting advice that has your best interest in mind. And if there's any conflict of interest, that it's disclosed. And while I think most of us would agree that the vast majority of advisors, investment advisors who are in this industry, do their work the right way and do great service to a lot of small investors, they're bad apples. And there are people, unlike the example given by Mr. Roscom, who actually go in there as advisors and tell people in my district, actually forget about people in my district, my parents told my parents, this is a great investment, did not disclose the interest, this individual did not disclose the interest he had in the investment, and my parents ended up losing what for them was close to their life savings at the time. That's what we're worried about, is making sure that these advisors disclose when they have a conflict, when it's in their personal interest to direct a worker, a consumer, or a small investor toward a particular type of investment product, because that advisor gets a cut of the investment without ever making it fully appreciated by that small time investor, that worker, that there's an interest that this advisor has in giving advice to go to that particular type of investment. That's what we're worried about. And it doesn't impact most of the financial advisors who do their work the right way. But I'm looking for the bad apples. And if you restrict me in going after the bad apples, then I have some real concern. And I wonder why we would try to rush legislation through at a time when, after 6 years of going through this idea of protecting consumers, that the Department of Labor is about to issue a regulation. We all don't know exactly what the regulation will say. We have a sense of the contours. But it seems to me to be putting the cart in front of the horse, and it seems to me to making our government be AWOL when we should be out there protecting consumers. And we already saw enough with Flint. We don't need to have another instance where government is AWOL when the American people and consumers expect us to be there for them. I appreciate your question, your answer to the question, though.
Thank you. All time has expired. Mr. Larson, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Becerra and Mr. Roscom, you give new meaning to carried interest, and so I appreciate what I perceive to be a compliment, though I'm not entirely sure. Let me say that I would like to associate myself with the remarks of Congressman Neal and share the concern that a number of representatives on both sides of the aisle have issued with respect to this rule. I would say that this is legislation that is born out of frustration. In a perfect world, and certainly not anything that's going to be accomplished this morning, in a legislative process when the legislature and the executive or an agency within the executive disagree, in most of our 50 states we have something called the Administrative and Procedural Law Review, in which case these things are hammered out in a nonpartisan basis on the facts. Both sides, and I certainly share the concerns of Mr. Becerra, Mr. McDermott, and others in terms, and I think Mr. Neal expressed this well, in making sure that it's the client that comes first and the customer that we protect. But as Mr. Becerra pointed out, this has been more than 6 years. And in 6 years, and let me credit Mr. Perez, who I think has been more accessible and done a good job in this area, but the process itself is flawed in terms of the actual exchange. No one here knows how many pages are even being considered or what the outcome of this bill will be. And there's a whole constituency class here, a group of people who are neighbors, churchgoers, and friends. Mr. Neal pointed out how we've gone in terms of looking that most Americans are going to be required to come up with their own benefits provided through their savings and their investments. And so that, as Mr. Becerra said, becomes vitally important that they're held to higher standards and that there is review. But it also has to be done in a manner in which they can actually have access to individuals and are not going to be turned away, and not by cumbersome laws, however may be well intended, do nothing more than deter someone from getting advice, or the very friends, neighbors, family members, or churchgoers who they have relied on to give them advice tell them they can't. There are other technical aspects of this that we could go into, but the bottom line is this. What we need to do is make sure that we're providing both accountability, transparency, and access. And that's all that we're trying to do. Procedurally, I could also agree that we could go out. I prefer to have a hearing. I prefer that we have the Labor Department. I prefer that we get more information. However, that's not what we're dealing with here. Mr. Neal made a suggestion before to join on to his bill. I would like to see the Ways and Means Committee, because this is something that just doesn't affect our committee. It's affected other committees as well. Take the lead in recognizing a concern here when there's differences between the legislative body and agencies. Our state legislative bodies have resolved this. It's long overdue for the Congress to come up with an effective way to deal with this as well. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any other questions specifically for Mr. Bartol? And we will have a chance to strike the last word and offer minutes as well. Mr. Lewis, you're right.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
What is the rush? Why not a hearing on this bill? Why now?
Mr. Lewis, I understand the subcommittee has not only done a great deal of work on this issue, but in a bipartisan way, crafted a very thoughtful, constructive approach that protects, expands consumer protections, and are bringing this bill to the committee under our jurisdiction in order to ensure those protections go forward.
we're not prepared to wait until we get a report from the administration?
Well, it certainly appears that as they are close to finalizing it, clearly, and we haven't seen that regular or final rule, it seems to me entirely appropriate for the committee to exercise our representation of constituents to bring forward what we believe are the best and the highest standards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Are there any other questions for Mr. Barthold? Seeing none, Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized for questions for Mr. Barthold.
Question I have is this. The House has passed, none of it's become law, as I understand it, of establishing precedent. My concern with this legislation is that it sets a precedent. Remember what we did with the pipeline, as an example, of providing a change before a rule is ever even submitted. I think it's a dangerous precedent, but steer me right, steer me correctly. What do you think?
That is beyond the scope.
When
Mr.
did you
Barthold.
stop beating your wife?
Yes. Mr. Pascrell, I really, you're asking a fundamental question of policy and policy design. I wasn't elected, and it's really not.
I agree here,
You
Mr.
think
Barthold.
that this sets a precedent?
If I may, Mr. Pascrell,
Yes,
Mr.
Mr.
Barthold
Chair.
is here to walk through the technical aspects of that. I think that's a question that's best be raised as we strike the last word and have debate on the bill.
Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions for Mr. Barthold? There being none, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does any member wish to strike the last word? Let's begin with Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, I think that having discussed with various members on the committee, both sides of the aisle, I understand what they're attempting to do, and I think it's well-intentioned. I don't think they're carrying water for anyone else. But my main concern with this legislation is I think it sets a terrible precedent in terms of the Congress passing a bill on a rule that has not been submitted. And that rule is dubious in terms of process by every stretch of the imagination. The Congress has a right to understand, into which valley it's marching into before we have to vote on things. And we're trying to have an effect on the rulemaking, obviously, and maybe that's dangerous waters. Maybe we're walking on thin ice. So our intentions may be good, but I'm very concerned with, number one, transparency, which I join members on both sides of the aisle in being concerned with. But I'm also concerned that this will set a dangerous precedent. And I know there's been attempts. There's been attempts by some members in other areas and other issues, and I brought the example out before the pipeline. Once you start down that track, you're not only checking the administration, which I think we all should be doing, but I think it gets us into an unneeded conflict. And I would like us to think about that, because you never know who the next president's going to be or the next administration is going to be. And I think we ought to take time to think about this. I think the Labor Department should take time also. I don't like the process they used in this. I think it was subterranean. I'm being charitable. And I think that we as Congress folks need to know what we're getting into. As I said, which valley we're marching into. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. McDermott, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When a patient shows up in a doctor's office, the question is, why are we doing it now? Well, that same question might be asked here about why are we doing this bill today. It's obvious why we're doing it. It's to do it before the rule comes out. As soon as the industry found out that they were writing a rule and it was going to be presented to the OMB, they said, pass the bill today. Get it done before the rule ever comes out. Now, this was designed to derail the important regulation that will protect consumers. And holding this markup is simply to undermine the department. In the time since it was introduced, we have not had a single hearing examining this bill, allowing both sides to come in and talk about whether it's a good bill or a bad bill. We don't know. On the broader issue of conflicts of interest, there has been just one Ways and Means subcommittee hearing, which happened before the bill was even introduced. In other words, none of the people up here on this dais have had a chance to ask questions from the industry about the legislation unless they happen to be on that one small subcommittee. Because of this, we simply can't understand its effects and how it will affect the people. Mr. Barthold couldn't tell me if it saves any money. GAO says $17 billion, and he can't tell me if we've saved a dime. This is not a way to legislate. It leaves us uninformed and forces us to make hasty decisions about a complex topic without an opportunity for debate. And debate's important on an issue like this. We all care about the investors. I don't think there's a single person up here that doesn't care about people who have got a little bit of money and put it in a 401k. I remember being in Zaire, in the State Department, in October 1987 when the stock market crashed. I couldn't get to mine at fiduciary to find out what I should do. People are out there and they are depending on the system, and they count on these people and they want to know what their qualifications are. Now, ERISA is a highly technical statute with profound implications. It's been there for a very long time. Its fiduciary provisions are key to protecting consumers from conflicts of interest and outright scams. And I recognize that striking the right balance between protecting consumers and preserving access to advice is a challenge. But over the past 5 years, the Department of Labor has been working tirelessly to do this. They didn't just get up one morning and say that they would want to do this. It was through extensive public meetings, through thorough economic analysis and careful consideration of thousands of stakeholder comments, the department has shown it wants to make the policy work. It's in the face of tremendous pressure from the financial industry. It is now being pushed forward here today. Now, the effort is more important than ever as workers continue to lose traditional pensions. In '75, when the original fiduciary rule was written in ERISA, about half the private sector workers participated in defined benefit plans. Today, the number has decreased to less than 1/5, 20% of the people have defined benefits. As traditional pensions have disappeared, 401ks, IRAs, and others defined contributions have become the norm. This has left the middle class on their own to plan and save for retirement. And all too often, Americans are victims of deceptive sales tactics by financial advisors. As the GAO uncovered in a report, in the 2013 report, industry abuses are widespread, which result in consumers winding up in high-fee plans that can devastate their savings. According to the Council of Economic Advisors, conflicts of interest drain $17 billion a year from retirement accounts of ordinary Americans. That money goes straight from the middle class pocket into the pockets of the fiduciary, the financial advisor. And at the heart of the issue that's addressed here is what kind of regulation should we have? It isn't an attack on business or on regulatory outreach or on people who are doing honest things. It's a thoughtful effort to help people retire with peace of mind and financial security. And before we vote on this, we need to do our homework. We need to have the regular order of the Congress, where the chairman puts out a mark You have a hearing, you have people come in and testify on the mark, and then you have a chance to say, well, what amendment should we make, and can we, but we're getting one shot,
Mr. McDermott.
100 miles an hour to pass this bill, and it's just not good legislation. I hope everyone will vote no.
All time has expired. Mr. Tiber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDermott, I know you're heartfelt in your comments. Mr. Becerra has been working on this for 6 years. Mr. Neal appropriately talked about Americans waking up today, half of whom don't have a defined benefit plan. I think about my mom and dad on a fixed income who would be the very people that would be hurt by this rule. And millions like them. And you don't have to have 20 congressional hearings, and you certainly aren't going to hear about it in Zaire, but you'll hear about it at your corner barbershop. Go to downtown Seattle, downtown Columbus, listen what the barber shop's customers are saying. Go to a local diner. There's a ton of anxiety in America about this. You're right, Mr. McDermott, this isn't about companies. This is about middle-class Americans, mom and dad trying to put some money away for retirement, save for their kids. It's not about millionaires and billionaires. They're going to be just fine under this rule. That's the irony, and that's the leadership that Mr. Neal has provided. This should be really easy. This shouldn't be complicated. This shouldn't be hard. This shouldn't be political. This shouldn't be about Republicans and Democrats. This shouldn't be about setting precedents.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will absolutely yield to one of the leaders on this issue in America.
You've hit the essential point. The principle here is the following. Wealthy people are always going to get advice.
Exactly.
What we're suggesting here is to ensure that the middle-income person is not frightened off from getting advice when people say, I'm afraid to give you advice. That's the point. It is not, again, to suggest that this has anything to do with wealthy people, because it really doesn't.
Thank you. I'm thinking during Christmas, Mr. Neal, my mom had a $7,000 IRA from when she was a seamstress at a local mall, little bridal shop, and what she was going to do with this $7,000 IRA. You know as well as I do, if under this rule, forget about it. She's not going to be able to talk to anybody of expert advice, and under current law, she was able to do that and get a person who actually is representing millionaires to talk to her about what the best place to put, the safest place to put her $7,000 IRA. And under this rule, that dramatically changes in terms of the ability of her to access somebody of that caliber. So I would just say to the gentleman from Washington State, this issue has received a ton of coverage, a ton of media coverage, a lot of Main Street coverage from our constituents who are out there filled with anxiety about what this means to their future. And I hope that we can all take a deep breath and work together to look out for moms and pops and people like them, like my mom and dad all over the country, who are going to be really impacted by this rule if it goes into effect. And I compliment Mr. Roscom and Mr. Neal for their leadership on this. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Becerra, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree that we've all discussed this quite a bit. In fact, I think we agree on quite a few things here, which is, I think, bodes well for the opportunity to do something good. I think we all agree that Americans deserve to have access to professional, informed advice that's offered in their best interest. I think we'd all agree that the vast majority of people who do this work providing advice do it the right way and for the right reasons to help people make good decisions. I think we can all agree on that. And I suspect we could all agree that most Americans aren't active investors on a day-to-day basis, and therefore don't know or aren't the most informed when it comes to how to best invest their money, especially if it's like my parents, a small amount of money. Let me read you something. Fred, who I've known for a long time, who helps me with investment advice. Whenever we communicate, and we communicate a lot on a lot of different things beyond just what to do with some money, every time he sends me an email, this is what he sends at the end of it. It's a disclaimer. Part of it says, IRS Circular 230 notice. To ensure compliance with requirements imposed by the IRS, we inform you that any U.S. tax advice contained in this communication or in any attachment is not intended or written to be used and cannot be used for the purpose of avoiding penalties under the Internal Revenue Code or promoting, marketing, or recommending to another party any transaction or matter addressed to this communication or any attachment. I get that every time he sends me an email, whether it's to say, hey, happy birthday, or did you enjoy getting together for dinner? He sends that because he's got to cover himself, right? You've got to be very careful about what kind of transactions you have with your clients so that no one can suspect that you're trying to take advantage of people because you're playing with their money. So here's the problem. It's a complicated world for those who don't live in it every day, yet they're putting their money in someone's hands. And we have to make sure that for a lot of folks, like we've just talked about, whether it's Mr. Roskim's parents or my parents, that it's used in the best way possible. The legislation that we have before us is preempting a proposed rule that's been in the works for 6 years. This bill has been before us for 1 month. And as I read it, I see some concerns. This legislation, from the way I read it, shifts the burden from the advisor to the consumer, to the worker, to Mr. Roskim's dad, and to my parents to make the best decisions on what's the best advice and whether it's in my parents' best interest. That doesn't seem fair to me when most of my folks probably could not explain quickly what I just read to you as one of the disclaimers that advisors send to us every day. And so if we're going to do something, we better do it right because it's precious, precious money for a lot of people. And it concerns me that we're in such a rush to do something that many, many people have been working on, including folks in the industry, for over 6 years. As I said before, if you see what's unfolding in Flint, Michigan, you see what happens when our government doesn't do it right. And I hope that the state government in Michigan gets on the ball because there are families in Flint who are being poisoned by lead. We don't need to have another meltdown in our financial industry, and we certainly don't need to have any more families see a meltdown of their small savings. And that's why we got to get it right. But to put the burden on my parents to know that the best advice was given, that there's no real conflict of interest, is a concern. And so when some advisor, whether it's Fred who helps me or the person who advises my parents says, this is a great investment for you, I would want to know, is it really the best you could find that's going to do the best for me? Or are you getting some money in return for having made that advice or given that advice and directed me towards that particular investment product? And what's the cut you're getting? And have you fully disclosed it? And have you disclosed it in words that I can understand? That's simply what we're asking for. And so we need to get it right. Will the proposed rule that the Department of Labor is going to issue get it right? We'll find out. Is this legislation going to get it right? We should go through hearings to figure that out rather than rush it. Whatever we do, we don't want to make a Flint, Michigan type mistake with other people's money. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meehan. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a brief comment, but I want to attach myself to the comments of my good friend from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, and I really think he hit this thing right on the head of what this is all about. And I look back on my own personal circumstance when my elderly father, was not aware of some of the things that he was doing with his money, and only later had an opportunity to go back and to reach and speak to one particular advisor who really got very little out of it, but moved a whole number of investments into kinds of things that were protecting him from taxes. And this advisor really didn't get much out of it. To be quite the opposite, he could have advised in a way in which he would have made more in the process. And it goes to the very heart of what troubles me about this notion that there's all of these people who have chosen as their way of life to be a fiduciary. This is what they have practiced. This is what they work on each and every day. And the first thing we're saying to them is they wake up in the morning looking on how they can scam Americans. When the fact of the matter is, the broad spectrum of them, as with any professional, wakes up in the morning and says, how can I help that client do something better? And what frustrates me is the very people who need this advice the most, the unsophisticated investor who has some little nest egg. And why is time important? Because time is money. And somebody can tell them how they can do marginally better. And we are denying to so many people out there the opportunity to have this kind of advice, which the rich get. And this is why it's almost Wizard of Oz-like here, in which we've got people arguing sides in which I can't really contemplate. It's usually from the other end. So I want to express my deep appreciation for those who have focused on the good in people. As a former prosecutor, where people do things wrong, they can still be held accountable, but we can't allow so many people to be denied the opportunity to have good, trustworthy advice to make their situation better because we're fearful of some small amount of people who abuse the system. And I commend the gentlemen from both sides of the aisle who've put together this very, very, I think, appropriate accommodation to find the right sweet spot. And I hope all of our colleagues will support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With all due respect, I think today, once again, on full display is what's wrong and broken here in Washington. We should be standing by middle-class working families, offering them adequate protection. Instead, we're obstructing that protection. I think it's well known that most Americans do not have an adequate amount saved to preserve the standard of living that they would want during retirement. Many of them have nothing but a Social Security check. And this committee could play a bigger role in encouraging more savings for working and poor Americans, that it's not done, rather than those at the top. This committee could have explored thoroughly the conflict of interest problem and proposed legislation to meaningfully address it, and I believe that it has not. Instead, what we know has been happening is that maybe it's not quite as much as the Council of Economic Advisors mentioned. Maybe Americans are not being ripped off $17 billion a year. Maybe it's only half of that figure. Maybe it's only $8, $7, $8, $9 billion every year that Americans, those who have struggled and scrimped and saved and sacrificed in order to put a little bit away for their retirement, subject to conflicts of interest, losing the resources that they should have as a result of their good savings habit for retirement because this Congress has not acted. Indeed, I'm reminded a little of a fellow I heard about who served from West Texas down at the state capitol in Austin when I was a legislator. I asked him, what do you do down there at the Capitol? He says, oh, I don't do anything. I'm just there in case somebody else tries to do something. Well, this committee's done a little, but it hasn't done very much about providing the protection against conflicts that are costing American families billions of dollars every single year. And when we talk about delay and taking a longer period of time, we're talking about more billions that ought to be in the pockets of those hardworking families that is going elsewhere in various scams and conflicts of interest. I think that There's merit to being critical of the Department of Labor, but I'm critical of them from a little different standpoint. It was 2010 when they proposed their original rule. They got many comments about that rule. They withdrew the rule. And then we went through 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, with not much being done. And now they have out a new rule, having had the benefit of the criticism of the initial rule. They've had about 3,000 comments to try to perfect that rule, and the response of this committee, which could have done more during that period, is to say, well, we haven't done much, but we don't think you ought to do anything. I participated in the one hearing in the subcommittee that Mr. Roscom called. It was a typical Washington hearing. There were 5 people there on behalf of providers and 1 person on behalf of retirees and consumers. I think probably the witnesses that we had are the kind of people that are providing services that are of help and benefit to people all over this country, as are the vast majority of people that provide financial advice. And the vast majority of people that provide professional, competent, helpful advice do not have anything to fear from this rule. They're not engaged in scams and conflicts of interest. But some people are, and it's an extensive problem. I believe that we need to respond, and we need to respond in a way that says we're standing on the side of American families who want to have a secure retirement, and we're not going to obstruct and block an attempt to do it. If the rule is put in place, it's not serving its purpose. This committee has every oversight responsibility and can take some of the action that it's failed to do in recent years. I urge rejection of this bill, and I yield back.
Mr. Kelly, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to approach this from the same avenue that Mr. Teaberry did, Mr. Neal did, Mr. Larson did. In 1970, I just graduated from college, and I went back to work at the family business. And my father called me in, and he said, I want you to sit in on this. We're going to actually have some people come in to talk about a retirement plan, and they'll be the administrators on it. And I said, well, you think it's important to me? He goes, not now, but it will be about 40 years from now. Well, let me just do on this. We got to be careful we don't paint everybody with the same brush. Because people get paid to do their job, that doesn't mean that they're ripping people off. I get a little bit confused sometimes because we let politics interfere with good policy. Mr. Neal, I think we feel the same way. I'm just going to mention 2 names. One is Jim Ippolito. Jimmy Ippolito worked in our parts department. He just died within the last year. John Reimers was one of our technicians who was with us for many, many years, stood on his feet his whole life, working on cars, raised a family, a big part of our community, both these gentlemen, big part of our business, big part of their churches. But you know what they weren't able to do? They weren't able to figure out what was best for them in their retirement. Because it's too sophisticated for the average person. I don't put anybody down by average, meaning that they're average people, but they don't have the background or the knowledge or the everyday working with it to actually understand what's going on. The one thing that I will tell you, the day Jimmy left the business, by that time my dad had retired and I had bought the business from him, Jim Ippolito came to me with his wife with tears in their eyes, thanking me for the fact that in 1970, my father had the foresight to put into action, something that was going to make their retirement possible because they knew they couldn't rely on Social Security. John Reimers came in the same way, and I can't tell you the number of people. And I'm talking about people now. I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about people who raised families, supported their churches, their schools, and their communities, and were part of the very fabric of what America is and the exceptionalism of what we're able to do. I'm stunned that after 6 years, we still can't figure out, with this great amount of knowledge, how to come up with something that actually protects these folks. The people I deal with are really fine people. They come in a couple times a year, and you know what they do? They sit down with the Jim Ippolitos and the John Reimers and all those kids that don't have any idea about how they should invest their money, but they need some guidance. They don't come in with the idea that I'm going to get rich really quick right now. by doing this. And then we put this fiduciary responsibility on us. Gosh, I mean, listen, we can keep raising the bar. You know what these people are going to say? Say, whoa, this risk is too great. I'm going to walk away. And who are we going to leave hanging? They'll go on and do something else. But what about all those folks that get up every day, get out of bed, throw their feet out over the bed, get up, put the breakfast on the table for their kids, clothes on their backs, a roof over their head, and plan for their future, and also want to make it safe that whenever they finally reach retirement age, that their kids aren't going to have to take care of them. My God, the one thing both my mother and my father said is, listen, if we become a burden, we don't want it to be that way. That's why we do these plans, and that's why we have to be so careful when we do these things of painting people with this brush that somehow, if they charge fees for what they do, they're bad folks. Millions and millions of Americans don't believe that Social Security is going to be there for them anymore. Hell, if we're worried about saving their retirement plan, why don't we talk about saving Social Security? You just don't believe it's going to be there. And it's an obvious reason. You don't put the money in, you can't take it out. Anyways, and I mean this sincerely, this has nothing to do with being a Republican or a Democrat. This has to do with being a son of a guy who had the foresight to protect the people that we worked with every day. It was mutually beneficial for us to be successful. And to making sure that every single one of those folks that came through those doors every day, that twice a month they were going to get a check that they could actually cash, and they were going to have something in the future that was going to make them think that, you know what, these are good folks to work for. I would just think that I hope all of us, when we go back home, our constituents look at us and say, you know what, these are good folks to work for. So I think, as Mr. Ross come here, thank you for what you're doing. Mr. Neal, thank you for what you're doing. If this isn't protecting America, I don't know what it is. Thanks so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kind. Excuse me, Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I'm not exactly certain that it's important that we are advancing legislation in this fashion, I think this conversation is critical. I believe from the bottom of my heart that retirement security is a pending crisis that is mounting because not everybody had the good fortune to work for somebody as smart as Mr. Kelly's father 70 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 20 years ago. We continue to be paralyzed in moving forward to take corrective action for Social Security, which is providing a bedrock for more and more people who thought they'd have something else. Pensions are disappearing. And we have more and more people who are in a situation where, with IRAs or their own investment, that they are responsible for investing for their future, and they are not up to the challenge. And it's going to get worse. So, by all means, let's dive in. But by the same token, it seems to me that we ought to acknowledge, and I don't think anybody who charges a fee is somehow a parasite. I know many people in this industry. I have taken advantage of their services personally on occasion, and who've been involved with me in issues about how we are going to deal with this building crisis. But maybe there's somebody on this committee who has a WikiLeaks source and has read the rule. Is there somebody on the committee who knows definitely what is in the rule that is yet to be released? I mean, Mr. Bartle, our staff hasn't. And so we're having people making these bold assurances about how we have to rush forward and undercut the rulemaking process before, to the best of my knowledge, and I didn't see anybody raise their hands who told me they had seen what was exactly in the rule.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will in a moment. I'd be happy to. Have you seen the actual rule?
Will you yield?
Yes. For 20 seconds.
We're not talking about a proposed rule. We're talking about a final rule. The Department of Labor could disclose the rule at any time.
Excuse me, Peter.
There's been no disclosure.
My time. Have you seen the final rule?
Right, and that's the problem, because it's a final rule.
Reclaiming my time. Nobody's seen the final rule. What my good friend Mr. Larson said is that Mr. Perez and people in the Department of Labor actually have been approachable. I signed some of the letters trying to make sure that some of these concerns were known and addressed. We're not going to have an administration that's going to undercut their rulemaking authority, even if it's terrible. You know, we'd have something to do if all our worst fears are founded. And if all those worst fears were founded, I think you'd see bipartisan effort to dive in and make some adjustment. But we get caught here with rhetoric that pushes people in positions that they don't need to be. I don't want any middle-income person who is frightened away or unable to access good, responsible, professional advice. But I'll tell you, I have somebody, I won't mention their name because it would be embarrassing for this person, but somebody who's very close to my family who was basically cheated out of most of her retirement security, not unlike what evidently Congressman Becerra's parents faced. This is real. It may be $17 billion that's, we toss around that may not make a difference to some of us. But I'll tell you, I know people who lost hundreds of thousands of dollars who are living differently today through no fault of their own. So I want to dive in. I want to work with the committee. And if the rule is awful, I'll roll up my sleeves and work with you. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we should tempt a veto. And I don't think we ought to divide ourselves unnecessarily. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your courtesy, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kind, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this conversation today. And listen, I have some sympathy for this legislation, but I do believe it's premature. Many of us who have been very active in working with the Department of Labor, Secretary Perez, the White House, Jeff Zients there, have tried to engage in a constructive conversation to help shape the rule in a way that helps democratize retirement savings opportunities for more Americans. And it was a short while ago, over the last few years, when we were considering comprehensive tax reform, when Representative Tiberry and I headed up a retirement security task force to come up with ideas and suggestions to work with the code in order to democratize these savings opportunities for more Americans. The problem we have now is we're operating in the dark. Mr. Barthold, we know that the rules now has been submitted to OMB. Do we have any indication at all how long it's going to take OMB to consider the rule and before it's published for all eyes to see? I know they have a 90-day window in which to consider it, but is this something that they're going to be able to do quicker than that, or is there any sense?
I've seen nothing, and we're not privy to their schedule.
Yeah, and when we did engage DOL this week in regards to the OMB review, they said that OMB might have an option to extend that 90-day period. If you look at the legislative schedule that we have on the calendar, there's plenty of opportunity for this administration to jam the Congress on a rule that may not be to our liking. And I think that's the angst that I'm hearing here on the dais. But to prejudge a rule that hasn't been released yet, that hasn't been available for public scrutiny, let alone our scrutiny, I think is putting the cart a little bit ahead of the horse. And I've give the administration some credit for the open door policy in engaging a lot of groups, a lot of individuals who have come in to express concerns in regards to a variety of the suggestions that the previous rule had in it. I mean, the whole pre-advice contract requirement is problematic to me. If this becomes a multi-page document loaded up full of legalese, my concern is it could scare away a lot of people who are in desperate need of good financial advice. But I also, in my conversations with a lot of financial advisors and brokers back home in my state in Wisconsin, I've yet to meet anyone who does not reject the idea of the best interest fiduciary obligation that DOL is trying to establish here. And there is a problem in the retirement savings community with some advice that some are getting. I think Mr. Neal pointed that out as others have today. And if you choose to ignore that, I think it's ignoring the reality that some individuals have been taken advantage of. And there needs to be some steps in order to provide better oversight or better protection for those individuals. But the details of what this rule is going to look like is going to matter. And the last thing that we ought to be supporting is a rule that's going to close the door for the financial advice I think many people need. Mr. Reichert and I, for a number of years now, have offered the SAVE Act to try to make it easier for small businesses to set up simple IRAs, to set up simple 401s, to make it easier for those in small businesses to have that opportunity to start saving for retirement in a meaningful fashion. And we ought to be doing more of that type of work on the committee, because I know there's a lot of bipartisan support for doing it. And so there's a leap of faith going on here right now with OMB scrutinizing the rule. But I think moving forward on legislation which would effectively block the rulemaking process and effectively block the engagement that we currently need to continue with the White House and with DOL is a bit premature. And that's why I'm going to vote no on it, but continue to engage the administration when it comes to coming up with a rule that makes sense for average Americans who are in need of investment advice, but also in need of some protection given some of the unscrupulous practice that we've seen occur throughout the country. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Black, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an interesting conversation as I sit here and listen, because I've been here now for 5 years, and one of the things that surprised me the most when people asked me back in my district, what surprises you the most about being in Congress? It was the fact that, that the executive branch had so much power, and especially in the rulemaking process. In our legislative process, when we passed a bill, it would go to the executive branch. They would then write rules and regulations, but the rules and regulations would come back to the body, and there would be a final discussion on those rules and regulations before it actually got promulgated into law. And so I find that it is one of the most frustrating things that I have experienced here on the Hill is that once a bill is given to the administration and they write rules, or they even write rules without a bill, that our hands are tied behind our back and it's very difficult to make a change. It is our prerogative to write a law. And if we see the administration is going in a direction that we don't believe is in the best interests of this country, it is our prerogative. We don't have to see their rule. We don't have to wait for their rule. We should be looking at what's going on and saying this is what's best, and we're going to take the tiger by the tail, and we're going to take care of it. So this whole thing, have we seen the rule? I don't really care whether we've seen the rule. If we believe something is correct and proper for our constituents and best for the people of this country, we should be doing it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I understand, appreciate, and agree with the motivation for the need to update the definition of a fiduciary standard to ensure investment advisors act in the best interests of clients. I've also met with many of my constituents who have expressed a variety of concerns about the proposed rules. And indeed, I'm one of those individuals who wrote the Secretary to urge him to seriously consider the concerns raised. However, the choice to bring up this bill today is premature. Premature given that the final rule has yet to be issued. Further, the provision undermining the Congressional Review Act and setting a new precedent that any executive action on fiduciary issues requires affirmative congressional approval is extremely troubling. Together, the timing and content of the bill appear to interfere with and halt any modernization of a fiduciary rule. This is very unfortunate. There's no need to act on this today, and I cannot support such an effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sanchez. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking Mr. Neal, Mr. Larson, and Mr. Roscom for their work in addressing many of the shared concerns with the proposed fiduciary rule. My goal has been to provide hardworking people in my district with the ability to safely save for their retirement, and that's remained my goal throughout this multi-year process. You know, where I come from, people feel like maybe the safest place to store their money is in their mattress, and I'm not kidding, or their sock drawer, because I've actually heard that from constituents, rather than to entrust it to a stranger that they don't know and they don't know if they can trust. Because when you're dealing with your life savings, trust is everything. But we know that it's not a particularly effective way to save for your retirement to stash money in your mattress, because that's never going to let you properly save for the money that you're going to need in your retirement. Only through improved education and access can we change that mindset and help people understand how best to save so that they can have some financial stability in their old age. And my concern with the proposed rule is that it won't thread the needle that we need to thread, which is to protect the consumer who is finally ready to take that money out of their mattress while ensuring that they have adequate investment options to achieve their retirement goals. I feel really strongly that the final rule should absolutely protect consumers from misleading advice, and certainly it should seek to punish the bad actors. That's a no-brainer. But it also can't close the door on a population that sorely needs somewhere to turn to figure out how to provide for themselves and for their family in retirement. With less than 40% of Latino employees ages 25 to 64 having access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan, it is really critical that we get this right. And that's just one subgroup, but it applies to every group in this country. So for me, I guess I'm going to take a hard look at the final rule to make sure that it meets the standard that my constituents deserve. But until I see that final rule, I think it would be also premature to make that determination. And unfortunately, that's why today I'll be voting against the bill before us. But I'm going to reserve judgment until I get an opportunity to see the final rule and see whether or not I think that that's adequate and that it does what it is supposed to do for my constituents. And with that, I thank the chairman and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Dole. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate you holding this markup, and I want to thank Mr. Neal, Mr. Roscom, Mr. Larson, and those that have come together in a bipartisan way to really try to provide an opportunity for all Americans. One of the things that I think that we want to try to do is we want to try to make sure people are incentivized to be able to put money aside for their retirement. And frankly, a good friend Mike Kelly was talking about his family business. And you know what? Those two gentlemen that he spoke about that worked their lives over there, I bet you know they know a car inside and out. They know how to fix an engine better than just about anybody. But when it comes to financial advice, they're in the dark. Well, that's the same is true. You need something. You want to get a plumber. Plumber's going to tell you inside and out all the different things that they can do inside that bathroom or in the kitchen sink or whatever it may be, but they probably don't have a very good idea about how to invest the money. We want to make sure that everyone has the ability to be able to take, whether it's $50 a week, $20 a week, whatever it may be, to be able to invest those resources. And what we're seeing right now from the fiduciary rule as it's been proposed would dramatically change people's access to have this advice. This is about the hardworking taxpayer that's looking to try to say, you know what, I don't want to keep my money in the mattress. I want to try to make sure that I'm able to invest it. And frankly, the hardworking individual that is there and is working to try to make sure that money goes to work, guess what? We want to make sure that individual that's giving the financial advice, they wake up every morning and they probably go to the same shop. They open up their door, they hang their shingle. They're there year in and year out. And the way they grow their business is not by the Ponzi scheme. And those that are ripping off the American public, we have to go after them, right? The idea that every single individual that's providing investment advice is all of a sudden out to get people, frankly, is a completely false premise. And I'm sure for those that are working their tail off each and every day to provide a better life for their family and provide a better life for their community, for those that are investing, they find this conversation offensive. One of the things that we all can agree on is we want people to be able to achieve their dreams. I don't know what that dream is for somebody in a different community across the country, but the long and the short of it, it's not my
not mine to determine. We want to give them the ability to have more options for their children, more options to be able to take out money in retirement. And honestly, you know, this idea about an end run around the rulemaking process, we're the United States Congress. We're hearing. We had over 300,000 comments at the Department of Labor, and I'm confident if you take any other scenario out there, that a rulemaking out there, this would probably be the one that most of us hear on a regular basis about. This is something that Congress can and should step up to do. Mr. Neal, Mr. Roskin, Mr. Larson, Dr. Rowe, they've actually raised the standard. And so from my point of view, we're agreeing on so much of the same things. We want to make sure that those middle-class, hardworking Americans have access to sound financial advice so that it's easier for them to retire when they want to. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first thank the sponsors of the bill, as mentioned, Mr. Roskin, in particular, Mr. Neal, and I want to align myself, I think, with the comments made by my colleague from California, Ms. Sanchez. I do think there were some constitutional issues with this legislation. I also think that it, in all likelihood, will go nowhere beyond the House. I don't foresee the Senate taking up this legislation or garnering the 60 votes who would need to pass it, and nor do I expect the President would sign this into law. I do, though, think that it has come about because of the frustration we're all dealing with the law, especially as it pertains to the Department of Labor and its inability, because of the law, to tell us exactly what is in the rule that will come out. I do recognize, as Mr. Davis has said, that there is the Congressional Review Act, which will give Congress the ability to look at the rule when it does come out. I also think that a very loud message has been sent to the Department of Labor in terms of the rulemaking that will come out, that there are Democrats who are very concerned about what that rule will look like and the implications that it will have for those we're all trying to protect, and that is those who are trying to find a way to save for themselves and for their families, as well as to have a fiduciary rule that is responsible and meets the standards that we're all looking at, and that is to ensure that the best advice is given to our constituents. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to give the balance of my time to my friend from New Jersey, to my left, who's actually to my left, very much so, Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Joe. Mr. Chairman, I agree totally with everything that Mike Kelly said before. That may be a first, by the way, but I do. More and more people, though, are living on a Social Security check. And the rules got to be workable. We don't know what it is yet, but I do agree with what you're saying. I want to go to one part of what may be the rule. This is what I've heard from, and I've talked to people in the industry. It's difficult enough to establish trust and encourage individuals to plan their future without requiring the signing of a complex legal document before an advisor even can speak about the client's financial needs and goals. The requirement in the proposal will only prevent consumers from seeking advice, leaving them on their own to come to these financial conclusions about their own financial lives. So the rules got to be workable, but in the light of the requirement under the best interest contract, the BIC, that exemption, some believe, I personally believe from what I've read and heard so far, although I don't know what the rule is exactly, the proposed rule would mandate a signed consent of 3 parties: the customer, the call center operator, and the company. Each time the customer contacts the company, even for the most generic kinds of information. I have a lot of concerns about this. I've said this before, and I want to commend the sponsors of the legislation. I'll go back in conclusion with my concern is that it sets very bad precedent. And you know, I'm concerned. We as Democrats we want to help enact the bill. Who are we to say no when the loyal opposition want to do the same thing for environmental regulations? That was my point before, or rules that implement the Affordable Care Act. We've been through this. So that's my only caution. But I want to, before I yield, say thank you, Mr. Kelly. And it's good to agree with you sometimes.
So noted. Mr. Nacy, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's interesting, as I'm listening to all the conversation, I think of the one presidential candidate who says, you know the problem in Washington, it's called Washingtonese. It's the language that we talk down here, and Americans don't understand it. They hear proposed and final, and we all know that the proposed rules, we know what they are, and the final rule, we know pretty much what it's going to be, but we're talking, well, we don't have the final rule in front of us. People back home seeing this are saying, what is going on here? And many of them are agreeing with my colleague, Diane Black, who, you know, once it's final, it's final. How do you fix it? So I'm concerned that this Washingtonese isn't going to get us to fix the problem. And I really do appreciate Mr. Roskin, Mr. Neal, and Mr. Larson for this bill. The other thing I'll tell you is about the first advisor I ever had. First advisor came up to me, and I, again, just out of college, and I thought I should start saving some money. And he said, Jim, let me give you some words of advice. He said, number one, if you put your money in the stock market, don't expect, you want the best advice, you're gambling with your money anytime you put it in the market. You could lose. You could lose everything. You could gain some money. The other thing that advisor, and by the way, this advisor didn't charge me anything, probably was the best advisor I ever had. He said, if you hear somebody talking about you're going to make 15 or 20 or 30%, run away from that investment, because it's probably not a good investment, because the more return you're going to get, the higher risk you're going to have. And those are the kind of advice that I received, my first advice, and I thought, you know what, it's true. So once you get into the market, you have to realize that there are going to be people that win, there are going to be people that lose, and the most important thing is nothing is guaranteed. So now I want to talk about those advisors. There's advisors out there. Look, they're coming in every day, these hardworking advisors, and they're trying to advise, and they're the best they can. And yes, there are some bad apples. There's bad apples in everything. But these advisors are coming in every day, and most of them aren't coming in to say, I'm going to try and make as much money as I can, like my friend Mr. Kelly said. Most of them are coming in and saying, I'm going to do the best I can. And I remember that advisor, when Mr. Kelly was talking, that came in when I actually sat down, and when you talk about small, my business at one time, most people don't realize I was in a nursing home business. I had close to 1,000 employees. And when that advisor came in, and these were nursing assistants, and these were people that were, you know, middle-class American, hardworking Americans, and they sat around that table and they heard the guy say some of the very similar things I said. I'm not going to guarantee you're going to make a lot of money. I'm going to help you retire. I'm going to help you put some money aside and retire. And I'm going to do the best I can. And I'll never forget that. And I got to tell you, some of those people still today come to me and say, I really want to thank you for pulling an advisor and talking to us in the language that we heard, realizing that we were risking our money, but today we have a little more than we had when we got started. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that we cannot talk about proposed and final. We have to make sure that in the end, these hardworking Americans that are putting their money aside realize, number one, they're getting advice, the best advice, but you got to remember that sometimes advisors are going to be wrong, and anybody around this dais that's going to tell me they've had an advisor that's always been right, anybody going to tell me they've had an advisor that has always directed them in the right way, I want to talk to them, because it just doesn't happen. There are people that give us the best advice they can, and sometimes it ends up being the wrong advice, sometimes it ends up being the right advice, but in the best heart, it's their advice, and you have to listen to it. So I look at some of those people and think, these people now have a little bit more money put aside. We cannot put us in a position where these individuals, these hardworking Americans, don't have this opportunity to save the money and to have an advisor because of what we want to say, I mean, is a proposed rule we pretty much, it's not a final rule yet, we pretty much know what the rule is. We know where we're going with this, and we really have to make sure we consider those hardworking Americans and make sure we support this legislation today so that in the end, a final rule doesn't get out there that hurts them, and we can look back at our people back home and say, this is what we're down here doing. We are fighting for you and making sure that we're protecting you. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. You're recognized.
Us now, we're going to close.
Mr. Levin, would I have time to close too, please, on the legislation
Be glad
itself?
to, yes.
Have him go next.
Are you prepared to?
I am.
Thank you.
You ready?
Mr. Neal, you're recognized.
The average Social Security benefit in America is about $14,800. The stock market has lost more than 1,500 points since the first of the year. The average American's retirement plan is now tied to that stock market. The number of people that leap out of the stock market and miss the recovery is extraordinary. The number of people who prematurely cash in an IRA and pay a 10% penalty to the IRS is extraordinary. So yesterday, as part of my credential here, yesterday the Teamsters were in to see me, to see if I would help them again, as I have over the years, on a multi-employer pension plan challenge that they have in the Midwest. They thanked me when they began because of my work on their behalf. On the Savers Credit, liberal advocate groups across the country have always said, thank you with wild enthusiasm for promoting the Savers Credit. The opt-out provision. During the Clinton years, I carried the retirement savings account proposal of the Clinton administration at their request as an addition to Social Security, not as a substitute for Social Security. My fondest hope is that when we close this discussion, that we recognize that this has been a bad time for savers. 8 years now. All one has to do is look at their savings account to see what has not happened during these 8 years. And actually, it's gone on for a period of time, and it's much due to the Federal Reserve, not to day-to-day politics. So my fondest hope is that we will reach an accommodation with the Department of Labor after we have expressed our legitimate and sincere concerns as it relates to what retirement ought to look like. The three-legged stool: personal savings, a retirement account, and the bedrock guarantee of Social Security. It's interesting in Congress today that if you don't fall into line immediately on every single issue, that for some reason there's an untoward motive attached, when instead there's a legitimate interest based on 2 decades plus on this committee alone, and having earned the reputation for paying great attention to what retirement ought to look like. And we have that responsibility here on this committee in particular. And I'll close with this nice note. Dave Camp tried every which way with Pat Tiberi to include my auto IRA bill at the end in his proposal. They both said, we went to the bottom of the 9th inning, but the objections on our side, we just couldn't get there. Both of them did it with sincerity. That's the conversation we ought to be having here on this committee. And I hope that with this vote today, there's just a chance to ever so gingerly nudge the Labor Department into reaching an accommodation and an agreement with the duly elected. And I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. You're recognized.
Thank you. Clearly, there is a challenge in terms of retirement in this country. That's why so many of us feel so deeply about the need to preserve Social Security. For the majority of people, it's the majority of their retirement. And I was glad, as ranking on Social Security, that I helped lead the effort over the opposition of so many in the Republican Party to keep Social Security. Look, no one is painting anybody with a broad or the same brush. There's no effort to do that. Essentially, what needs to be done is to separate the wheat from the chaff. In this area, the vast majority of people who are participating, from my experience that goes back when I was a young lawyer working on retirement, the vast majority of the people are wheat, are people who are solid, who are looking after the interests of their clients. There is a problem because there's some significant chaff that needs to be addressed. And that's what this rule is all about. It's been said here, under this rule, it dramatically changes. I don't know how anybody can say that when we haven't seen the rule. And so I want to close by indicating the dangerous precedent that this legislation would set. Essentially, in this legislation is an effort to put the reins provision into play. That's a serious mistake. The Republican Party has tried to do that, essentially handicapping the effort of government to issue regulations pursuant to legislation. And it's been said by Mr. Becerra and others that we should learn from Flint what it is all about if we handicap government from doing its work. When the Reins bill was brought up on the floor of the House, only 2 Democrats voted for it. And it's a serious mistake, I think, here. I'm not sure it's the intent of all the sponsors, but it's in this legislation, to place this basic approach of Reins into this bill. And what would happen is, whether it's OSHA or the environment, EPA or whatever, that no rule, no regulation pursuant to legislation would become law without an affirmative, positive vote of both houses. That's essentially a ticket to, I think, so handcuffing regulation in this country that we would see a duplication more and more of what we have seen in Flint, Michigan. So I hope we will reject this bill. We'll see what the Labor Department comes forth with. I hope it will be responsive to the information that has been supplied. The department has assured us that they have been listening. And I think now to legislate before we know what is in that rule is really a serious misstep. So I urge a no vote on this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Rossum. You're recognized.
Thank you very much. Chairman Brady, thank you for your leadership in this, your first markup, and the tone and demeanor that you've created with your leadership in guiding the committee, and thank you for your consideration. I want to affiliate myself with Mr. Neal in his remarks. The disposition, the attitude, and I think it's interesting. Did you notice something? We're legislating. What a delightful thing that we're trying to take a complex issue, trying to come up with a bipartisan solution, come up with a remedy, and move forward. And if you listen to the subtext of everybody, we share a concern, and that is the ability of savers who don't have the affluence necessarily to always guarantee that they've got the best advice to get the best advice. So what's the remedy? The remedy is that in this bill, what we're doing is we're creating a standard that doesn't exist today, a new best interest standard, so that when you get the feedback from an advisor, you know that the law requires that advisor to put the interest of the client above their own, the interest of client above the plan. That doesn't exist today. This creates that standard, and at the same time, it ensures that the folks that we've all articulated concern about make sure that they have access to that advice. Secondly, it's important, and I want to draw a distinction here. We have seen in this discussion this morning phrases conflating into one. We've heard the process of a promulgated rule being conflated as if it's only a proposed rule. We're not talking about a proposed rule today. The first proposed rule from the Department of Labor met with such ferocious opposition that the Department of Labor pulled it back. They were like, whoa, we're not moving forward with that one. Department of Labor pulled their own rule back. They did another proposal, and they've said, this is after 300,000 individual comments on it, and they've said, we're assuring you we're taking it all into consideration. And here's the solution. All they've got to do is disclose what they're proposing. Just disclose it. You've written it. It's done. It's not holy text that can't be shared with anyone. It's over at OMB. They've got it, but they won't disclose it. There's no prohibition from their disclosure. What can they do? Simply repropose it. Put it back out there. See how it shops around. See how the 96 Democrats who opposed these first proposals, that they were assured were fantastic, by the way, how does it meet with that standard? But they're not willing to do that. Isn't that interesting? So what we're actually talking about now is not a proposed rule. We're talking about a final rule. And a final rule, as we all know, has the force of law. So what happens then? It has the force of law. And all the plans begin to change. So it's not the proponents of this bill that are trying to move quickly. It's the administration, the Department of Labor, that's trying to move quickly and silently and quietly and secretly. Why not disclose the rule? Why not satisfy the gentleman from Oregon so that he can see the rule? I haven't seen it. Nobody's seen it.
You're going to see it.
We need to see the rule. And in absence of knowing the rule, and based on striking out twice, I think it's perfectly reasonable that the Ways and Means Committee, in a markup, after a hearing, moves forward and says, we're going to engage substantively on this. And we're going to do it on a bipartisan basis, and we're going to create a new standard. And let me close by saying this. Mr. Doggett criticized the witnesses who came before our subcommittee as providers. Well, one of them is a jobs provider, and she came up from the Carolinas. And let me just read you shortly a quick paragraph of what she wrote in a letter to Congressman Neal and to me. Her name is Patricia Owen. She says this: most of my employees are young adults who don't yet see the value of retirement planning. And because it's unlikely that they'll seek retirement advice on their own, it's even more important for my business to provide it to them and our plan's advisor. However, if the rule is implemented, I may not be able to continue providing employees access to financial advice due to increased plan costs or the reluctance of financial advisors to service small plans. Let's fix that together. I yield back.
Thank you. And to finish out, thank you for the debate and discussion today. I want to thank Mr. Larson and Mr. Neal and Mr. Roscom for the hard work, months and months and months, to do this. Fiduciary means guardian. In this case, guardian of the best interests of your savings and your investment. This bill, very thoughtfully, makes sure more people can hire a guardian in their best interest and make sure there's high standards for that guardian. That's really good work. And as to the timing, it's never a bad time to give people more access to those types of guardians. So I thank all the members for the work they've done. For those who have reservations, I hope you'll keep an open mind as we go forward. And with that, with no further amendments, question the adoption of the amendment, the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. Why don't we do a roll call on the final bill? Got her. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4294 as amended to the House of Representatives.
Questions on the favorable reporting of the bill as amended? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the most agreed to. In H.R. 4294 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Dold? Mr. Dold, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Bustani? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
Yep. Important work again. Clerk will report the vote.
26 yeas, 12 nays.
On the vote, this vote, the ayes are 26 and the nays are 12. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 4294 is amended. It's ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives without objection. Ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional change days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.